Here we go.
Okay, great.
There she is.
Well, welcome if you're watching online. Thanks for joining us again. We're going to continue to live stream adult Bible class. And this is a bit of an unusual one, that on Labor Day weekend we're actually having a class. So I would call this bonus class. So we just decided, and actually our attendance was actually pretty strong at 8:30. So I'm really glad we did this, because if we had done one combined service, we'd have had too many people at one time. So far for worship, the most we've had in any single worship service is about 135 or 40. And we can accommodate that pretty well. Once we start to get to 200, we're maxed out. And our normal attendance in the past, I mean, there were Sundays, very rarely, but even 8:30 would be right close to 200. Our normal attendance at 8:30 is 150. And then normal attendance at 11 is about 290, something like that. And we just can't accommodate that many people safely if we're following the Southeast Idaho Public Health guidelines. So even now, I feel I don't ever want to become the church nag, but we're kind of need to remind people, let's keep keeping a little bit of distance and let's just be safe as we can. And a lot of that, y'all, is because of our school. We want to keep school going.
Sure.
And so if we have an outbreak anywhere, it impacts everything. So far, so good. We've had to have some kids quarantined because they've been in contact with positive cases, but they themselves have not. So far the protocols have worked quite well, because it's both in the elementary and the high school we've had to do that, and it's worked out well, and now the kids are back in. So, they were there in the quarantine for a number of days and came back in. So anyway, so here we are. So this is really kind of, as I say, kind of a bonus session. This is a session that I wanted to share with you on Peter the person, because we're going to do a study of 1 Peter. And then I'll probably just go on to 2 Peter. And just do 1 and 2 Peter. And that'll probably take us, past the new year. It'll take me that long to do that. Because 1 Peter should take us about 10 sessions. Well, and if you're familiar at all with 1 Peter, this section is huge. A living hope, right? It has this whole idea of living hope, even though you're in great persecution. And Aaron, I'm putting you on the spot. You might even look up a little bit for me, but I'm trying to remember, we date Peter, we date the writing of 1 Peter in the 60s. Again, let's think of markers. 30 AD, crucifixion, let's say round numbers, 30 AD. So 4 BC, Jesus' birth, 30 AD, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, right? Pentecost, birthday of the church. Then 70 AD is destruction of the temple. So those are the big markers that we have, okay, in there. And in between, now we have this first generation of Christianity. We have the disciples. Jesus has risen, has ascended. The Holy Spirit has come. The church is now empowered by the Holy Spirit to share the good news. At first, the Christian church is perceived as little more than a nuisance. The Jews are unhappy about it because they're running around claiming that Jesus is the Messiah and that he's risen from the dead. Now they're unhappy, but they don't have any power. The Romans, they're just a client state. The Romans are in charge. And the Romans just find it irritating, because the Jews were already quite irritating to them anyway. They just kind of bugged them because they were obstinate, and they said that they were God's chosen people, and you can't put an eagle in our temple, and you can't do this, and you want to have your own kind of money, and all this stuff. So the Romans they just found them irritating. But now, the Jews are starting to make repeated, adamant legal arguments. So in Rome, you needed to be a recognized agency. I'll give you an example. In our denomination, the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, so we have churches and we have schools. And so a church, and typically a church, sponsors a school. Well, I've been in communities, Seattle and Portland, where in the school we had, or the high school, it couldn't be sponsored by a single church. Like Grace doing this, we're one of only 5 in the Synod, in the national body, in which a single church is sponsoring a high school. One of only 5. And so mostly, a high school is an endeavor that churches band together. So you might have 3 or 4 elementary schools and middle schools that feed it, and then you might have 10 to 30 churches who combine. Hey, you guys, good to see you. And you might, grab a page there. That'll help. That'll help. And so then you might have, 20 or 30 churches. Like in Seattle, we had 30 churches that sponsored Seattle Lutheran High. In Portland, for Forest Hills Lutheran School, we had about 20 churches that combined. And so that's what you typically do. In those associations, they're called recognized service organizations. So like the Lutheran Women's Missionary League is a recognized service, or an RSO. Or Lutherans for Life, it's an RSO. That kind of thing. So it's a recognized service organization, kind of has the blessing of the church. Well, that's what Rome wanted to have for religions. They wanted you to be an RSO, a recognized religious organization, RRO, we would call it. So the Jews were one of the recognized organized religions in the first century. We're talking about the setting for Peter. And so if you were recognized, you were fine. You were legal. You kind of had to pay a little taxes, or you might have to give something to Caesar or whatever. And a lot of the religions were, you had to at least bend the knee to Caesar and acknowledge that. The Jews didn't do it, and they gave them a pass on that one. It was kind of strange. It was kind of interesting. But they were obstinate. So now, though, in the early church, now the Jews are going, hey, these people they might be Jewish mostly, but now a bunch of them are not Jewish, and they're not us. They're a different group. They're not our religion. And that caused the Romans to take note, if for nothing else, for 2 reasons. Rome was all about keeping order. Okay? That was the rule. If you were a governor or a procurator of any situation, the first rule was no riots. Because if you have riots, witness in our country today,
No taxes.
no taxes. The economy's shut down. Business is closed. People ain't working. They're destroying things instead of building things up. So the whole idea is maintain order. And their reason was very mercenary, right? Very mercenary. So that we can make money. We want to tax you. And the other thing was, also, we need you to be loyal to the empire. So that was why they did the Caesar thing, all of that. We can't have you fomenting rebellion against us. So the Christians, or followers of the way, were not a recognized religion, and they do not become so until the Edict of Milan with Constantine. So that's almost 3 centuries. 312, am I right? 313? Something like that. Edict of Milan.
Yes, 313.
313. So that's the situation. So Peter now is speaking to a church which is started off mostly Jewish, now has Gentile Christians in it. By this time, we're now about 30 years after the resurrection of Jesus. So we're entering about to the next generation, and they are being persecuted. So that's 1 Peter is the setting. They're being persecuted badly. 1 Peter is powerful, though. None of these letters are very long, but chapter 2 has one of the great doctrines and practices of our tradition. And all of Protestantism clings to this, but Lutherans were really credited with really leading the charge in chapter 2 on what's called the priesthood of all believers. So, as an example, so we had some tragedy in the congregation. I talk about it in church a little bit, preach to it. Betty Prebino went to glory last night. Had a heart attack, took us by surprise. Jim and Teresa were there. The night before, my wife and I were in Salt Lake City baptizing little baby Cash, a 3-week-old preemie. And then he passed. Friday night. So last night, Betty, night before. So think about that on either end of the spectrum. So this was Brian and Nikki Finney's grandson. And we've been praying hard for him, little Cash. He was just 24 weeks. So we knew it would be touch and go to start anyway. He fought hard and just couldn't quite make it. So Teresa and I were there, and Teresa and Jim were with Betty. So those things happen. And then now we're in the middle of a pandemic, and you watch the news, and you see scenes from around the country, and you wonder what's going on. There's turmoil, and it really, to be honest, genuinely, other than the personal hurt we feel when there's a loss, especially the little one, it doesn't begin to compare with the persecutions they were facing. They were facing dismemberment and execution and imprisonment and loss of property and livelihood and so forth and so on. So Peter's words are filled with hope, but it's also empowering, because in chapter 2 he talks about the priests of all believers. And I said to Nikki, I'm calling Nikki, and I said, Nikki, because she said, please can you hurry, we're driving down. We were up in the Copper Basin and got the word when we were driving through Arco, where Brian says, can you make a trip to Salt Lake? I said, of course. So we just stopped at home, showered, and kept going. And so we get down there about 8:45, but about 7, I'm calling Nikki, she's down there, and she says, it's not good, it's coded once. And I said, Nikki, you get up there, you baptize that little boy. And it's not as if God doesn't love him or won't save him or anything. It's just what a gift it is. And any believer can do it. Anyone. Any believer. And you know that? Does not require a priest. Does not require a pastor. It just, our understanding is it's just a believer, because it's not in the power of the pastor or the believer, it's in the power of God's promise. Right? So I said to her, you get up there, you baptize him. If you need to. She said, no, we're just praying to hang on. And I tell you, I got there, they made me wait about 30, 40 minutes, and then I got in there, and probably 10 minutes after I got in there, he passed. So, but anyway, it was, so this is what we're living in, right? This is what we're living in. So 1 Peter, I think, is going to be a powerful lesson for all of us. And I hope a bunch of you will join online, tell your friends, because we're going to keep doing it live streamed, and we'll do that. But let's talk about Peter himself. Let's just talk about the author of the book. So it's interesting, and I'll probably talk about a little bit of textual criticism and things like that, because there are groups who say, oh, Peter couldn't possibly have written this letter. There's 2 reasons that they cite this, and it really came around, it was never called into question, a little bit in the 19th century, much more now after about 1960, it really began being called into question for 2 reasons. They go, Peter's a dumb fisherman, he can't do his good degree. Okay, that's the first objection. The second objection is that Peter refers to Rome as Babylon in this letter. And they are saying the only literature we have that refers to Rome as Babylon is after the destruction of the temple, which would mean after Peter had been executed by Emperor Nero. And so those 2 arguments are poor. The second one is, both of them are very poor arguments, because the second one about no one calls it Babylon until after 70, that's an argument from silence. We have not even begun to touch barely the number of manuscripts and writings that talk about Rome and its center of persecution against the church and so forth. So that's a weak argument. It's almost like saying, well, Idaho is the gem state. Well, nobody refers to it until after 1980. Well, all that means is you never dug up the other stuff that talks about it before then. You know what I mean? Just because you haven't said it, it's one thing if you say it's not that. But anyway, yeah.
Couldn't Peter have been referring to the Babylon of the past?
Yeah, in fact, some commentators note that. Yes, absolutely. Mm-hmm. The source of persecution against the faithful in the past. And in fact, it always has that double meaning. I mean, even in Revelation, it has that double meaning. Because there's the ancient Babylon, which was an absolute persecutor, and then there's the metaphorical connection of Rome as Babylon, and then the reformers refer to Rome as Babylon, but that's the papacy. I mean, they even refer to it that way, the corrupted church. So it has all kinds of things, but certainly, yes, the Babylon of Nebuchadnezzar, persecutor of the faithful. Yeah. But the other one, that Peter's too dumb to write this, is so hilarious. Peter is a businessman who owns his own business. He lives in an area which is 2-to-1 Gentile to Jew. And so they're Latin speaking, they are Aramaic speaking, they are Greek speaking, and you did all your commerce in Greek. So transactions, financial transactions were all done in Greek. And so if you were a businessman and you didn't know Greek, well then you really are stupid. Now, is Peter's Greek literary enough? Because the Greek in 1 Peter is quite good. I mean, it's not Hebrews, and it's not Paul. Paul's a sharp cookie, if you don't know that. Paul is a sharp cookie. His literary use of language, his understanding of the Old Testament, his theological training, he is a sharp cookie. We would probably call him a high seminary level, highly trained graduate type of student in theology, in Old Testament theology, certainly. He was that guy. But we would say that Peter was certainly a college type level understanding of theology. I mean, this is a guy with a strong working knowledge of multiple languages, but he's a businessman more than anything. Businessman, but now he's beginning to apply. But the cool thing is, we know that Silas was with Peter. And Silas is a Greek. He's Greek. It's his native language. So he will speak, I mean, he's a member of that. And so his ability to write. So we think that Silas and Peter together, Silas was probably a secretary and probably made some editorial suggestions and helped clean it up and so forth. Anyway, so when we think of Peter, let's do this. Let's do this. When I say that, what's the instance that comes into your mind of Peter? Okay, let's see. And if someone takes yours, go to your second one. Will you participate with me? Go ahead.
The denial of Christ.
Okay, great. He denies Jesus 3 times, right? What's another one?
When he couldn't walk on the water.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, tell me to come to you, Lord, right? And they seize the waves and save me, Lord. So Jesus, Peter walking on water. What's another one?
Crucified upside down.
Yeah, in tradition tells us, he said, I don't deserve to be crucified as my Lord, crucify me upside down. The method of his execution. What else comes to mind?
That he's the rock. He's been called
Yeah,
the rock.
so his confession, right? You are the Christ. And I say that, and then Jesus says, you are Peter, Petrus. Peter has 4 names. He's the only one, by the way, of the New Testament era people that we know of who has this. What are 4 names? Okay, we got Peter. What's another one?
Simon Bar-Jonah.
Simon, right? So Simon, that's but his very traditional Hebrew name is actually
Cephas.
Well, that's good. That's Greek.
Okay.
Oh no, I'm sorry. It's Aramaic.
Oh.
Cephas is Aramaic, but Simeon is his very traditional name. So Simeon, Simon, Peter, and Cephas. Cephas in Aramaic. So, and Cephas is one that means stone. Now this is interesting. There's some debate about what does that mean. Okay. Well, anyway, we'll get to it. What else do you think of with Peter? Anything else that comes to mind?
Self-centered.
Yeah, maybe he's like, yeah, okay, I'll take that argument, yeah. What's another word you might use to describe him?
Was that thing as leader of the Jerusalem church.
Okay, very good. He certainly is the apostle to the Jews, where Paul is the apostle to the Gentiles, but he is certainly the leader of the disciples, right? He's always listed first, isn't he? Who are the other 2?
James and John.
James and John. There's 3. So it's interesting. It appears that Jesus had divided his not caused division, but he had made 3 small groups out of his 12 disciples. So they were 3 groups of 4, and there was like a leader of each of those groups. So Peter, James, and John are the executive branch, or they're the representatives. But Peter is always listed first. Okay.
I would like to change that to arrogant. To that being self-centered, to being more of arrogant.
Okay, fair enough. You
Yeah.
know what's the word I would like? See if this makes sense to you. Brash.
Well, he's that too.
You know what I mean? He's like brash. He steps into it every time.
Yeah, okay.
He's like the first to step. He's the first to go.
That's a really good
Our dollar word is impetuous. It's
Impetuous.
Okay, that's better.
Here's another clue into Peter. In the Gospel of Mark, and Mark, we know, so John Mark was a young man who accompanied Paul and Barnabas on their first missionary journey. And remember, we studied this, and then Mark got cold feet and left. He was probably 18, 19 years old. He was a kid. And he probably got scared because they ran into opposition, and he bails. And he goes back to Antioch, goes back home, and Paul then hacks Paul off. It's like, he doesn't have any backbone, And so, but Mark he gets restored, and he becomes a key member of the Apostolic Church. And he becomes Peter's amanuensis, is the word we use, his secretary, his scribe. So when you read the Gospel of Mark, almost certainly, in fact it's Clement and Papias, they all say those are the remembrances of Peter, that Mark has written that down. In fact, wasn't Clement alive during Peter's lifetime?
Yeah, because Clement's old. So the first Clement's written in the 90s AD.
Yeah, 95.
And he's old by that point.
Yeah.
So he would have known both Peter and Paul in the 60s when he was like my age, like in
Right.
his 30s, he would have known them. And that's why we think, and he even says that in like the style of Mark, that because it keeps saying, and then, and then,
Right,
and then,
immediately.
and then, right? And that sort of idea, it sounds like Peter can't stop talking, or like
Right.
he's so excited.
Right.
And Mark's like scribbling furiously to get all this stuff down.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the impression you get. And Clement gives that, kind of hints towards that in that first epistle. So it's pretty cool.
So it seems that that's kind of a characteristic, a personality trait of Peter's, that he is impetuous.
Like when
and
he
brash.
sliced off the ear.
Right?
Yeah, right? Yeah, that's a great one too, isn't it? Remember that? Peter slices off the ear of the high priest's servant, yeah.
Well, I was thinking, relatively off topic, when you talk about people who actually did the writing of the scroll, is there any way that you can actually do a handwriting analysis with them trying to write as small as they are to try to get as much on the paper as possible, or does it all end up being very, very uniform?
You know, if we had others to compare him to, you probably could. So like if you could absolutely verify that the copy of the copy of the copy that we have, but the manuscripts, the actual physical manuscripts we have are in fact copies of copies of copies. And it's almost certainly a scribe and a scriptorium. And so whether that's a monastery or it's in a home, Paul writing a letter from prison, but we don't have those. They call those the autographs. The autographs are the ones like Paul writing in prison, dictating to Luke a letter to Philippians. We don't have those. That'd be the greatest of all finds. Then you would actually have the actual handwriting of Luke. But what happened is that letter goes to Philippi. They read it. They say to their other friends in churches, you have to read this too. So they say, well, let's make 4 copies. And then they distribute them out. And then they make 4 copies. And then they make 4 copies. And they're revered. But we just don't have enough to do. But yes, you're right, Bob. If we had it, we could do it. You'd be able to then know an unsigned document if it matched one that was a signed document. That'd be a huge find. But no, we have copies of copies. But many of the fragments and pieces that we have do go back. We have stuff from 2nd century. We have fragments, papyrus, and so forth, yeah.
There's still a manuscript of Mark, so we're mentioning Mark, that's being dated right now. So there's a Center for New Testament Manuscript Studies, Dan Wallace, if you know Dan Wallace.
Oh, yeah, you bet.
So Dan Wallace, New Testament textual critic, Christian, but he's considered one of the leading textual critics in the Christian world. Critic does not mean that he's criticizing the Bible, it just means it's the critical reading of the text, like what's the original reading, right? So criticism doesn't mean that you're insulting it, it just means that you're right.
It means you're asking questions.
Right, and so he's a Christian, he believes even in biblical inerrancy, actually, he's one of those guys. But they actually go all around the world and they take high definition photographs of biblical manuscripts so that all scholars have access to them. In 2014 or 15, they discovered a manuscript of the Gospel of Mark, it's a fragment, that's still kind of going through the dating and kind of like the pure analysis, but they think it actually might be 1st century.
Oh, that'd be amazing. Well, we have a fragment of Matthew. But
Right.
we're almost 100%
Right.
certain. Of course, I always have to be careful because I want to date it.
Right, and that's why he's careful, which to his credit as a scholar, he's saying, I don't want to, make you too excited. But he's like, there are definitely some that believe this would be, 70s, 80s AD, which would mean it could be either a direct copy of the original, or it's like, 1st or 2nd generation copy. Which, and again, and that's the part about this whole thing, you look at it in that text, and it lines up with our critical text. It's not like every time we discover something, the changes are so minimal that there's no changes.
Right.
And that's what's so encouraging about it.
It's funny, one of the great opponents of the veracity and authenticity of the original text is a scholar named Bart Ehrman. And he is widely at Duke University, and he just, for whatever reason, just has it out for the Bible to discredit it. And it's interesting because he will make a statement this is just like the news today, right? Let me make a statement that will make you think something, but it's not what it really you think it is. So let's say there are 300,000 variants in the New Testament text. Okay, 300,000 variants. What does that sound like?
Mistakes.
Yeah, it sounds like 300,000 mistakes. In other words, it doesn't agree. Well, the problem is half of them, first of all, are punctuation. Half of them. Just like that. And then you take the next half, and it's plurals, right? It's like plurals, like an S on the end, or no S.
Or 2 N's for John instead of 1 N.
Right. So it's that kind of thing. So it's like a misspelling. So first is, and then there are probably about less than 10,000 actual variants where over the years we look at them. But you look at the course of the whole thing, and you look at that and say, well, and this variant might be an addition, which we quickly take out, right? It can be an addition. Sometimes it can be, and sometimes it's an editorial note, which isn't often notated. So anyway, it's just, people do this all the time. They attack the Bible constantly, wanting to have you lose trust or lose faith in it. The neatest example I could actually give you is from the Old Testament. Because with the Dead Sea Scrolls, when we found that, the oldest version of the Old Testament we had was from about 1000 AD. That was the oldest version we had. And it's actually the text of my Hebrew Bible, Codex Sinaiticus. It was found on Mount Sinai, monastery in Mount Sinai, in the garbage. And so it was from 1000 AD. Well, then when they find the Dead Sea Scrolls, that backed it up 1,200 years, more than 1,200 years. So we have manuscripts from in the 225 BC, and you know their comment is, hey, cool, we'll compare them to the ones from 1,200 years later, because think about it, how many copies would there be over 1,200 years? At least 4 or 5. Let's say you kept it for 100 years. I don't know, 10, 12 copies. And the ink was not like we have today, and the paper or the vellum, it's not like we have today. I mean, and so when they compared the book of Isaiah in particular to the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was essentially, there were 9 letters different. I mean, that's a big book. So it's astounding. Again, I tell my classes all the time, that does not prove that the Bible is God's Word. It does prove that the people who handled it believed it was. They treated it as if it was God's Word. Don't screw with this, right? You don't mess with this. So it's kind of amazing that that was preserved. Think about that, 1,200 years, and really, virtually. And it's hand copied. No Xerox machines. I mean, there's no, you know, all hand copied, letter by stroke, yeah.
Just a point of clarification for the people listening. Codex Sinaiticus is a New Testament copy. What you're talking is the Masoretic text.
Oh,
so
yeah.
Codex Sinaiticus, along with Vaticanus, and those are New Testaments. So Codex Sinaiticus is a New Testament.
Okay.
So just clarification. In case
No,
people,
fair enough.
Yeah.
So when we go back to Peter, okay, so Peter is Mark that is the scribe for Peter. And so it has that sense of Peter's personality, and immediately it goes, and immediately he goes, and he moves on. It's very fast. Peter, in fact, is the one of the Gospels that has no mention of Jesus' birth or boyhood of any kind, where even John will at least mention, you know, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. But Peter and Mark, they have no time for that. He just launches right into Jesus' adult ministry, and it's the shortest, briefest, most to the point of all the Gospels. So, when we talk about Peter, if you look at this outline that he has here, this is just kind of a neat little piece to have for you. We know he's a fisherman, and I love how this little thing begins. The first words to Peter from Jesus were, "Come follow me." The last words from Jesus is, "You must follow me." From John, the Gospel of John. And so it's really interesting how that's the call to Peter to follow him, because Peter, it appears, was a man of his own mind. You know, there are too many times, just like many of us, where he believes that he's got a better idea than Jesus. And, you know, the most poignant one, probably, go ahead.
I was about to say also, the second, "You must follow me," is very likely, "You must follow me in persecution and death."
And to the cross. Yeah. And to the cross. So when the most famous one of Peter's, where he really kind of blows it, is he has just had his greatest victory with Jesus, really, when Jesus says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter, on behalf of the disciples, says, "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." You know, and Jesus affirms that. "Blessed are you. You didn't figure this out by yourself. My Father in heaven revealed it to you." And then he says, "And I'm going to give you a new name. Here's your new name. It's Cephas." Right? In the text, it uses that Aramaic word, kephas. And so it means stone. It doesn't mean prudential. Don't think of that like a cliff. It means, but it does mean, it also does not mean, I did some careful study on this, it does not mean pebble either. Some people have asserted that. And I think I've had to correct myself on that. As I've studied it, it means a real stone but it takes many, many, many of those stones to create the church which God is making. So Peter in his confession, just like the other disciples and all those early believers, were key stones that Jesus was laying, but Christ himself is the cornerstone, right? Peter acknowledges that. Think what a neat play on words that is when we get to chapter 2 in 1 Peter, when he talks about Jesus is the cornerstone. He's the stumbling block. Because Peter's talking about it also from his own perspective. Jesus called me a stone. I'm nothing compared to that. And his was a stone that I stumbled over, right? I struggled. Because remember, he says you're the Christ, and then Jesus goes, well done. Now let me tell you what that means. It means that I'm going to be handed over to the chief priests and scribes, and they will execute me, they will kill me, and on the third day I'll rise again. And and then it's so great because Peter, you can just see Peter, he's like, Jesus, a word? And he kind of pulls him to the side and he goes, you can't be saying that. I just said that you're the Messiah. What are you doing? What are you, nuts? You're talking about being executed as a criminal? I just said you're the Messiah. And you said I was right. And see, in Peter's mind, the disciples, Messiah meant King David on steroids. That's what that meant. King David with superpowers. That's what that meant. Not a criminal, not a humiliated, suffering Messiah. So, and then Jesus, of course, says, stop being the devil to me now, Peter. You're tempting me to do the thing that would bring me glory and the thing that men think are great. But God's ways are different. You're not thinking like God. You're thinking like them. So anyway, it's an interesting, it's just that Peter is this guy that moments of his greatest valor, courage, also shows moments of his greatest weakness, right? Think of the walking on water. Or when at the Last Supper, I will die for you, Jesus. Even though everyone desert you, I will die for you. And then, to Peter's credit, he's like, just him and John are the only ones that kind of follow after him. They're hiding a little bit, but they do. And then when he's confronted about, I hate you, were one of his disciples, and of course, so at his greatest courage, he shows his greatest weakness. His greatest victory, he shows his greatest loss. So many, many of us, I think, relate to this guy pretty well, don't we? It's, I find it with Paul, I find it with David, I find it with lots of these clay-footed guys, but who ultimately God hangs in there with them, shows patience with them, and continues to affirm them. So, anyway, you can also see here on this on the map that's here, these are the churches to which his letter is really going, and where persecution is most rampant at this time. So you can see where that's happening. Peter himself is executed late 60s, very near to the time of Paul. They both lose their lives in Rome. And then Peter too, it's interesting when we look at that, because obviously the Roman Catholic Church has a different view on Peter, that Peter is in fact that first and founding bishop of the church. And then there is a succession kind of thing that they follow, and different traditions follow different things. For us, we struggle with that because we're always going to ground everything on Christ. In our tradition, everything's going to be grounded on Christ. So I tease, some of my Catholic and Orthodox friends when they talk about apostolic succession and this and that, and I kind of go, I'm not sure why that's such a big deal, but it's in their tradition. Aaron can speak to that in some detail. But the Roman Catholic position is the church was founded. Peter is the founder of the church. Initially, things actually go okay. There are key cities of the church where there are bishoprics. What would we say? It's not Constantinople. What would it be called then?
But it was Constantinople.
Constantinople.
But it was Byzantium, but it wasn't built yet.
It wasn't Constantinople yet.
Yeah, it wasn't
But
built
then
yet.
there's headings of the church for various, Alexandria is one, and Rome. And
Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem because of its historical center, Rome, and then a couple of others that kind of become important in Greece, like Thessalonica, Thessaloniki, that becomes a big one.
Yeah.
And then also, they go east for a while, and there's a couple.
Carthage, is that one?
Yeah, Carthage is one, Hippo,
Oh,
another
yeah.
one, so northern Africa. So there's those regionals, even as France, Lyon, France,
Oh, yeah.
Gaul, there's like a church in Gaul. The country of Georgia is the first country to actually make Christianity, the king adopts it. And so Armenia, Georgia, those mountainous areas, they have Christianity very early, center there. So it's definitely dispersed almost immediately. It's pretty cool.
So for centuries, there is this pretty great fraternity of bishops and of these key Christian cities. And the way they describe it is that Peter is first among equals. So that always sounds kind of interesting to me, doesn't it? He's first among equals. So it means we all really have the same authority, power, but he still is the prime one. The only comparison I can kind of find to it is almost my role in this church, for example. I don't get 3 votes in church, or 10, or 100. I get 1. Like when we have a vote as a church, I have a vote just like you, right? Same thing. But at the same time, hopefully, you asked me as your pastor to also lead and serve, and that therefore I would have a certain amount of influence when I'm able to share. So I have no greater power than any of you, but you have entrusted me with some leadership. So it's kind of like that. So in any formal way, like I can't sign legal documents for the church, for example. I'm not the owner of the church. I'm not that. The secretary and the president of our church council are our legal signers.
I tell people it's like the speaker of the House, or like the president of the Senate, or the Senate Majority Leader. They don't get an extra vote. Their vote counts just as one, right? They have to be elected just like everybody else. But they set the agenda, they get to sit in the front, they get to have the honor, they're kind of like the senior leader of the party, right, those sort of things.
Right.
And so I tell people that it's kind of like the president pro tem, or the Senate Majority Leader, or Speaker of the House. So they're not king, but they do have a certain ceremonial and agenda settings, and that's kind of how the Bishop of Rome was viewed. And Eastern Orthodox, to this day, will still give him that title, if they're willing to say that, first among equals, the patriarch or whatever of Rome. But they just are not willing to say that he's the patriarch of the entire church.
Right.
And so that's where that shift is. And that's where, and I think you would be with me on this, most Lutherans, Anglicans, and others would agree with Eastern Orthodoxy on that point. That if you look historically, that seems to be how the general church viewed that, right?
Right.
And that's kind of where you're going.
Right. Yeah, where we would struggle is we don't see that structure and form in the scripture itself. So, and that's where, like, when I talk with Father Constantine, he's like, oh, you leave so much stuff out. You Lutherans, it's all about the Bible. It's only the Bible. He says there's more stuff. That's kind of the way he describes it. Early church history and patriarchs, and they include those things, especially those ecumenical councils, as just as authoritative as what we would call the canon of Scripture. So that's where we depart ways a little bit. The Reformation was, his comment to me is, the Reformation threw the baby out with the bathwater. And and that you jettisoned so much stuff that you lost a lot of stuff. And I said, no, what we did was we kept the main thing. And you guys miss that sometimes. Sometimes they're so much about trappings and process and procedure that Jesus almost seems to get lost. So that's how we talk to each other. We have some fun that way. But so here's another thought. Let me just share with you, because we only got about 5 minutes here, maybe 10, before I have to hand this back to our other stream for worship. Here are some scenes from the life of Peter to give you an insight into who the author is of this letter that we're then going to start studying next week. So, the call of Peter. Remember that one? So, what's Peter's profession? Fisherman. Okay, he's in business. And he's clearly in fisherman. Probably his business partner might be Zebedee. James and John appear to be younger than Peter, and they are the younger working on the boat with Peter. So it almost appears that he may be in a business partnership with Zebedee, whose 2 sons are James and John. And then, of course, there's Andrew, who is Peter's brother, and Andrew's the one who's first introduced to Jesus. And Andrew is the one who kind of comes to Peter, and Peter doesn't bite right away. Hey, and so picture the picture. In the Peter's family, Andrew's probably the younger brother who didn't really want to fish. He wanted to study. He wanted to go to school. And so he loved to study, and he loved to be in the synagogue, and he was on the lookout for the Messiah. And Peter was probably the older brother who had to be responsible and had to make sure that they're living and carried on the family business. And so here comes Andrew with his pie-in-the-sky foolishness, and Peter essentially ignores him. Until Jesus comes walking along, and we have different scenes here. And remember the scene, why don't you go out and cast your nets out, right? Go out there and cast your nets out. And here's Peter, he's the professional fisherman, right? But essentially he says, okay, fine, what can it hurt? And then they catch this huge catch of fish, and then remember the scene? Peter jumps out of the boat, right? So they were working, and they worked close to naked. Jewish men never were quite naked. They were very, very modest. Jewish men clothed themselves from here to here. That was the deal. And they wore head coverings. And so, but for working men, if you're out in the boat and you're casting nets or you're in the water, that stuff could kill you, right? If you get out there and all that junk gets wet, it could kill you. It could drag you down and not allow you to. So they would take off their outer garment and they would cinch up those clothes and wrap them around. But here comes Peter, and he is so overcome by Jesus, the miracle, he jumps out of the boat. And remember what he says to Peter, to Jesus? I mean, it's so funny. It's kind of a paradox. He's drawn to Jesus. But he says to Jesus, go away from me. I'm a sinful man. That's the call of Peter. So isn't it interesting? Peter has this really kind of schizophrenic almost, that's too harsh a term, contrasting. He has a great self-awareness. He knows his weakness. He knows but he also is brash and bold and takes the first leap. So he's got this working all the time, battling each other all the time. When we study Paul, we see a lot of that too, right? The good that I don't want to do, but this, and the evil that I don't want to do, this I keep doing. I'm a wretched man. And then he says, but I am Christ. Nothing can separate me from Christ. So this is not at all uncommon in followers of Christ. I'm sure it's true in all of us too. There's that kind of tension that goes on. So that's the call of Peter. Come follow me. And it says, and immediately they packed up their nets and they followed Jesus. So he walks away from the family business. Another scene that comes very, very quickly on is Peter's mother-in-law is deathly ill. And they go to his house and Jesus heals his mother-in-law. And then it says, and immediately she began saying, good Jewish mother, are you hungry? Have you eaten? And so she begins serving them and all of that. And it's interesting because it also is one that sometimes with our very conservative Catholic brothers, we go, hey, Peter had a mother-in-law, he was married, it's okay. And so the whole idea of a celibate priesthood, we find that to be a much later addition. In fact, we know that. For centuries and centuries, priests married and had families. Many number of centuries. He heals the mother-in-law. Another time, then of course, we get to this Matthew 16, who do people say that I am? What about you? Peter's confession of Christ is a huge centerpiece of hinge point of their acceptance of Christ as the Messiah and just the beginning of understanding what it meant. Then you have the transfiguration. Think about that one. So Peter is one of three. Remember, Peter again is kind of a goof here, right? They're up on the mountain, and you just see Peter, James, and John. It's kind of like, yeah, we're hot shots. We're the important ones of the disciples. And they goes up to the mountain with Jesus. Jesus transfigured, and they're wetting their pants flat on the ground, And then Peter is like overcome, and he's like, oh, we should stay here. And Luke, of course, you got to love Luke, and he goes, he was actually kind of out of his mind. He didn't know what he was saying. He was overcome, probably overcome by the presence of God and the glory of God. Just overwhelmed. And Jesus very tenderly, I love it, it's beautiful. Matthew and Luke, when you combine the two, so beautiful. Jesus comes and touches them. When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. It's a beautiful, beautiful passage. But he was a witness of the transfiguration. He quotes it in his letters. We were eyewitnesses of the glory, of the divine glory. Another one is at Gethseman, right? So he takes Peter, James, and John with him again into Gethseman. He says, please pray with me. How's he do there?
Not really well.
Yeah, not so much. You know, falls asleep 3 times. Jesus says, really, can't you just for an hour, can you hang in here with me? And he's not able to do it. Peter, of course, then at the arrest, is violent, slices off the ear and then runs away. And then chooses to follow. And then, of course, you get the denial of Jesus. And then Jesus looking at him and he weeps. And then, of course, they get the word from the women. Hey, the tomb is empty. Who goes? Do you remember who goes of the disciples?
Peter.
Peter and John. And he says John got there first because he was younger. And so John got there first, but he didn't go in. Peter goes in. Peter's the first one in the empty tomb. He's the first one. So Peter at the empty tomb, and there's the angel. Why are you looking for the living among the dead? He's not here. He's risen, right? Go and tell him, I'll meet you in Galilee. He'll meet you in Galilee. And then, of course, after the appearance, they appear before them in the upper room. And then, of course, they do go to Galilee. And then, of course, you have this reinstatement of Peter. For me, this is the scene with Peter that touches my heart the most. All of those are very familiar. We know them all, don't we? Transfiguration, and denial, and Peter's confession, and Lord, get away from me, I'm a sinful man. I'll die for you. Even if everyone deserts you, I'll die for you. Here's Peter. So this is the guy, right? This is the man whose letter they're going to study. But the reinstatement of Peter, to me, is the one that I think frames the rest of his whole life. Because Peter is sitting there on the shore, and we don't have any record of any conversation of Jesus with Peter. And you can imagine that Peter is nervous, can't you? John 21. That he's anxious. Because Jesus could just absolutely say, Peter, you lost your right to lead the group. You cannot be. Now, if he knew Jesus' character, he would know that was not the case. But and then Jesus asks him the questions, right? Do you love me? Do you love me more than these? And it's very ambiguous. Do you love me more than fishing? Do you love me more than these guys love me? Right? Do you love me more than the things of this world? We don't know, but Peter says, yes, Lord, I love you, and I feed my sheep, and so forth, until finally, the 3rd time he says to him, do you love me? And he says, you know all things, Lord, you know that I love you. So Jesus reinstates Peter with those words of forgiveness and love, because he says, care for my flock. So that's what we get in 1 Peter. You get a man who's been reinstated by Christ, who's been sent to share the gospel to people under persecution and trial, that they too might feed his sheep. So that's the setting that we get. You guys have any questions for me on this? We'll jump into the introduction to the book, 1 Peter next week. Good? All right, let's say the blessing, and then I'll let you go. The Lord bless us and keep us. The Lord make his face shine upon us and be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace. Thanks. All right. See you again soon. Okay, now you can talk.